I saw that many of you have been to the We Built a City We Can't Afford presentation. And this is that presentation, but it's slightly modified for this group because um, that presentation is intentionally geared towards the public and for folks that aren't normally dealing with our issues. And since this group specifically works in this realm of real estate, we targeted it a little bit more because we're going to talk about the largest real estate management corporation in Kansas City that is fundamentally responsible for the health and well-being of all of us and all the people in our city. And it's upside down in debt and liabilities. And you know which corporation it is. It's larger than the ones we think about as being our leading corporations in town. It manages more assets than either Cerner or Garmin. And the reality is that it's falling behind. The infrastructure in Kansas City is crumbling, literally. We all know our school systems are suffering. And we also know that crime has become an incredible issue for us. And I'm going to make the case today that a lot of this is a real estate issue and put this into that context. So one of the things that we've been sharing with people is this new way of understanding how our cities work. And that's what this map is all about. And I'll come back to this later because it's a key part of how we in our planning studio are helping communities go forward. But I'm going to be providing some 101 courses throughout this. I think we have 3 101s and 1 201. But this is the first 101 course. This is on city building. So people have been building cities for 5,000 years. And over those 5,000 years, we've been through multiple trials and errors. And what you find is all around the world in all different cultures, the same conclusions are reached. These cities are from, again, a variety of different situations and contexts, including frontier America, but they all have very similar patterns that we can recognize in city building. And it's because we've had 5,000 years to learn how to do this as a human species. And you can see that pattern here in Kansas City. We started in 1850 as a small village on the river. Within 80 years, we had built a full-fledged city. This is our downtown in the 1930s, thriving during a business day with all sorts of street life, a very vital streetscape, as you can see, with a robust streetcar system already. If you back away from that, you can see that within 80 years, we have built a pretty impressive skyline and a very impressive welcome center in our city. We know that we've got the Parks and Boulevard system, which gives Kansas City a unique advantage because we have a design pattern that we can follow, and it gives our city a unique character that I think most of us appreciate. What most people have forgotten about is to get to that city in 80 years, we also built the infrastructure necessary for it, which included nearly 100 miles of streetcar. And it's a little surprising for people to hear that because of how much struggle we've gone through over the last 20 years just to get the few miles that we've built recently. But that was just a natural part of people following their predecessors and the patterns before them to build cities the way that we did. So this is the Civics Lesson 101. If you go back into the founding of the country, you can find history of the founding fathers talking about property ownership being important to a new government like ours, which is based on independence. And the thought was if we could get a majority of people to be private property owners, then we would have more likely to be success in those majority of people controlling their government and keeping it from being getting out of hand. So there were all sorts of motivations baked into our governing since then, including things like the the way that Thomas Jefferson came up with the meets and bounds way of surveying property that allowed us to quickly survey the entire country, which allowed it to be sold off quicker. We had the railroad expansion, and the Homesteading Act, which allowed people to acquire farm acreage. Then we got into the 1900s, and still most of us weren't living in our own private homes. We were still renters. So then we came up with, the government came up with the federally subsidized home loan program, which made 30-year mortgages possible, which was the first time that most people then could afford to buy a home. And throughout the 1930s, those programs became more accessible and affordable. And then we come back from the Second World War, with the largest baby boom, the largest market ever created in the country. We come up with the idea of an interstate highway system, and all these things are setting us up for a new way of building. But the point that we made in our other presentation is that there is this one disruptive technology that really changed the game. And in 1950, most American families owned one of these new disruptive technologies, and it changed the game for city building. Now, I said most, and I've said some things along the way that were motivated for people. Actually, this has been, there's been motivations that have benefited a majority class, but there have been a lot of people left behind. I'll come back to that, but I need to recognize that as we're getting into this discussion. If you look at the impact that cars had on our city building, the primary message is that cars changed the governor. Up until the 1950s, we built the way that our predecessors had. We worried about being close together because cities were opportunities for both commercial exchange, cultural exchange, sharing amenities. Being close was important up until 1950, but by the time most of us owned one of these, close was a different definition, because now 15 minutes or 15 miles could be driven in 15 minutes, so proximity totally changed. And if you look at the pattern of city building in Kansas City, you can see what that did to us. So if you can see very smallly there on the river is the original village, and then within 100 years, we grew to a city of 500,000 people almost, and living within 81 square miles. And then we all got the disruptive technologies, and we took advantage of it. And we started spreading out into the surrounding less expensive land, and pretty quickly had a city that was 320 square miles, almost 4 times what we had at 1950. Our problem was we still only had about 500,000 residents. So, the easy math tells you that since there's 4 times as much city, there's 4 times as much infrastructure responsibility for everybody living in that city, since the population didn't grow. But the way we've built infrastructure for the last 100 years is actually at a different rate than we built it before. So when you do the studies around the country, which this group Urban 3 has done for many cities now, they find that the disparity is as many as 10 times more infrastructure per person than we used to build prior to 1950. So if you look at the street system in Kansas City, you get a pretty clear picture of it. This is our map again, but it shows all the streets we built since 1950. The streets that are in black are the pre-1950 streets, and that supported 500,000 people. And then we built all the red streets, and now we still have 500,000 people that are responsible for taking care of all that. If you lay out the lanes of our city, there are 6,500 lane miles, which is enough lanes to start in New York, go all the way across the country to San Francisco, turn around and come all the way back, and essentially build a 2-lane road, and then have enough road left that you can go up to Portland, Maine. That's a lot of street, if you can imagine trying to plow that much street overnight. And we can put a value to those streets, and we did a very conservative number. I'll tell you that the numbers are actually higher than this, but just for discussion, those 6,500 lane miles in today's dollars should cost about $5 billion, which means that since streets last, if you take care of them for 50 years, we ought to be putting aside about $100 million a year to take care of our street infrastructure. And they might last 150 years if you take care of them along the way. So if you add the maintenance cost of that, we need to be putting aside $124 million a year for our street system. This was a banner year last year. We got to a $16 million year. The Public Works Department went to the city council last year and recommended a $16 million budget, not because they knew that was what they needed, but because they knew that's all they could get. And frankly, that was more than they had been getting in previous years. And last year was also a banner year because we had the GO bonds to help us. So between our normal public works request and the general obligation bonds that were from that $800 million that we all approved a few years ago to address infrastructure maintenance, we had $23 million to address our street maintenance problem, which is about a fifth of what we just calculated. So even though we've got more money now going towards infrastructure than we've had in a long time, it's only a fraction of what we need. And if you go back to that white paper that the Public Works submitted to the council that requested $16 million in funding, it also advised that we are well behind. Our streets are falling apart to the point that they advise that we need $166 million a year to get our streets back to a fair condition. Not a good condition, not a new condition, but a fair condition. And that's 10 times more than they could ask for. And that's fundamentally the problem that we're facing. So if you look at the development pattern since 1950, we've built a lot of this kind of development. This is a pretty typical form, a development pattern that we're all familiar with. It's built all around our city and everybody's cities. If you measure up all the streets within that typical development and you allocate it to every house, every homeowner that lives there, they have about 136 linear feet of street. If you go back through the math about how much they should be putting aside to take care of that street, it's about $657 per year. If you go through the taxation and the way that we charge property taxes and calculate it for a $250,000 home, that's our example in this model, you find that that home is generating $94 a year for street maintenance and it's needing $657. So there's a factor of 7 that we're short in terms of taking care of the city that we built to take care of this development pattern. Now, if you go back to an urban pattern, you can see a different end of the spectrum. So this 14-unit residential building needs 50 feet of street. So a much different proposition. Each of those units only needs about 4 feet of street to get to it versus the 136 on the right-hand side. So there's a differential there of 37 times. But if you track through the value of a $250,000 unit, assume that both sides of the equation are $250,000 homes, the way that we tax our residential property means that in both cases, we're getting $94 for the streets from those residential units. Because of the efficiency on the left, it's actually netting resources. It's actually giving money back to the city that the city can do other things with because they got more than enough resources to pay for their share of the infrastructure. But the example on the right, the post-1950s development pattern is far short of that. And that's happening every year. So when you compare urban to suburban, it's not surprising that there's a major differential. But if you compare pre-1950 residential patterns to post-1950 residential patterns, you can already see that there's a difference. Just by the way that we used to lay out our streets and lay out our lot patterns. They were much more efficient because prior to 1950, we were still in that mode of wanting to be close together and having the benefits of proximity in a different framework. But it was more than just this because prior to 1950, we built neighborhoods with a diversity of housing types. And we're all familiar with these style of multi-unit buildings that are scattered throughout our historic Central City neighborhoods. And they actually make our traditional neighborhood patterns 6 or 7 times as productive as the way that we've built neighborhoods since 1950, since we got the disruptive technology. Now you can track through the same math and see that the example on the left is dramatically more productive than the example on the right. What's surprising to most people, if they haven't seen this before, is that if you take the average home value down to $50,000 with a pre-1950 neighborhood, it's still so efficient of a development pattern that it generates essentially the same amount of money that the post-1950 and what many people would consider to be the affluent neighborhoods are generating in terms of tax revenue, which is the income side for a city. It's the resources they need to take care of all of the infrastructure that we've built. So now that we have this new way of understanding our city, what should we do going forward? the first point, we've got 3 points that we're sharing with people. The first point is that once you recognize that we've got at least 4 times, probably more than that in terms of infrastructure per person, and we've got far more infrastructure than we can afford to take care of, then we should be very careful about building any more of it. So since this is a group of real estate professionals, I'm going to make a proposition to you. I'm going to come to you as a developer and say, Mr. Real estate professional, I'm going to give you this development. And from the minute you get it going forward, you're going to lose $600 a year on every home in that development. Congratulations. You know, that's essentially the development pattern that we've been tracking since 1950, because we didn't know to track a much more expensive cost of maintaining that development pattern. So as we go forward, we ought to be looking for better returns on investment for our infrastructure investments. There are some examples in our community that we can point to, both north of the river, this is up in the Shoal Creek area, and in the southern part of the metro. There are development examples that are very productive, that are some of the more productive parts of our city. And they've been built new and built since 1950. And we can point out those examples throughout our city. And we should be expecting better returns on investment like these developments are providing their communities. The second point is that we have developed in a way that the cost of maintenance far exceeds the resources that those developments are generating. And as we know that we've been through the budget process over the last few months, we've got a challenge, because right now there's our budget pie. This is actually the 2019 and 2020 budget, but you can see the budget pie. You can see the red sliver is what we allocated towards street preservation. This is how much we need. And you know how successful it would be if we just robbed all that from all the other programs that we try and support in the city. So we're not going to be successful, at least not overnight, changing reallocating all the budgets so that we can increase the street preservation budget by 10%. But we have a different opportunity, particularly we as real estate management professionals, because now that we understand where the productive parts of our portfolio are, we can expand as we go forward by investing in more of those productive areas. So back to this map. This is indicative of mapping that a group called Urban 3 has been doing for cities for the last 10 years now around the country. They've probably done this for 50 cities, and one of our goals with the speaker series was to get funding for them to do it for Kansas City, Missouri. And fortunately, the Kauffman Foundation has been working with Chamber to explore opportunity zones, and the folks at Kauffman felt like this study would help inform that discussion. And so now we have a value per acre assessment by Urban 3 for Kansas City, Missouri, and for Kansas City, Kansas. What this map shows us is return on investment, frankly. And it shows it both as a heat map and as a three-dimensional map. And it helps us see in a snapshot where our city is productive and where we're getting good return and where we're not. The purple colors are those very productive areas, and the green colors are not productive. They're the ones that are costing us money. And unfortunately, we've gotten to a pattern where there's far more green than there is warm tones. If you look at this as just as a map, looking down two-dimensionally on it, this is how we're used to seeing our city. So this is how we value our city today and how people talk about property value, because it's the value per parcel. So it makes sense that we think about it this way, because that building's worth 1.5 million, that home's worth $250,000. So we think about that as the real estate value. But it's not a good measure for return on investment for a city, because it doesn't adequately measure how you apportion the real estate or the infrastructure investment across your portfolio. So because a $1,000 home could be sitting on a quarter-acre lot or a 3-acre lot, and it's still considered a $250,000 parcel. If you look at it on a value per acre basis, I'm going to flip back and forth for a second, you can see the valuation change dramatically. So here's value per parcel, here's value per acre. Why that's important is because that value per acre is more effectively measuring the return on the infrastructure investment. because those are properties that are generating enough resources to pay for the maintenance of the development pattern that they've created. So if you use some of the examples we've already talked with and you put them on this valuation scale using the value per acre map, you can see that the mid-rise residential on the left is up in the $3 to $5 million value per acre range, whereas the development pattern on the right is down in the $100,000 to $200,000 $1,000 development range. And you can also see that our pre-1950, what we would consider our challenged neighborhoods, where homes are only worth $50,000, they're performing just as well as our newer 250,000 a home neighborhoods because of that efficiency of the development pattern. And it's something that we can learn from. If you look at the development pattern on the right, it's hard to change that street pattern, but you can still improve the productivity if you follow the other lessons from the pre-1950 neighborhoods and have more than single family homes, because those other multifamily type units create a much higher return on a per acre basis, which is how we need to think of it in terms of paying back our public investments. Now, most people resist multifamily units in single family neighborhoods. That's a post-1950s reaction that is not justified by the return on investment discussion. And there are plenty of examples of multifamily styles of units shown in these slides here, from accessory dwelling units to duplexes to multiplexes, and even into these cottage courts on the bottom left that are much more productive uses of single family residential land area that can be easily interspersed within single family neighborhoods and not be the challenge that most people consider apartment living or multifamily living to be. And we need to get more comfortable with having those discussions and allowing those styles of housing into all of our communities, both to make them more productive, but also to make them more accessible so that there's more opportunities for people of all income levels to afford to live in all areas of our city. So we've got this other issue, and this is the third challenge that we've got that we're recommending we pay new attention to, and that's our tax policies. This phenomenon where we can have a very productive development pattern on the left and a very expensive non-productive development pattern on the right, but we get the same return on investment because of our tax policy, because we determine taxes based on the value of the parcel and not in a way that really measures the public investment. So because we value property tax largely based on the value of the improvements and not the value of the location, we have situations where the most productive parts of our city, on the left, that's our downtown area, which Urban 3 is shown to be the most productive parts of most cities. In our most productive area, we've got one of the least productive development patterns in the forms of surface parking lots. A primary reason why we have that development pattern there is because of our tax policy. It encourages people, it allows people to invest in that property and hold it because it's fairly low cost as long as you don't do improvements on it. Once you do improvements, then you have to pay taxes on that. But we should be paying taxes for the value of the location, and we should be getting better return on those parts of our city. And if we had a taxation policy that valued the location, which we all know in real estate is the right way to think about it, it would encourage people not to sit on it and to put such a low productive development form on it. That same phenomenon is what's caused a lot of the disinvestment in our central city neighborhoods, because somebody can buy a home that's falling apart and just let it go ahead and fall apart, because then it doesn't cost much to hold that property for years. And many people are doing that and putting that property into their family trust, and it's deteriorating and bringing the neighborhood around it down. And we've seen that pattern now for many years in our central city communities, and it's a result of our tax policies. So 3 steps that we're recommending going forward. Let's be very careful about building any new infrastructure. Let's be more, let's demand better returns on our public investments in that regard. And then secondly, let's get better return on our existing infrastructure. That's where our great opportunity is to use what we've already built and make better use of it in terms of the development patterns that we get out of it. And then third on the right, this is the challenging one because it gets up to state government level. But let's have discussions about changing our tax policy so that they can encourage the kinds of development that we know will bring good returns on our public investments. This presentation is intentionally geared towards a discussion on streets because it's easier for people to track that. But that same discussion in terms of development pattern can be applied to many of our public services. So many of you remember a debate that then Mayor James and one of the police commissioners had a few years ago. It was on the front page of the paper where the police commissioner was saying, we need more money. And Mayor James was saying, you get plenty of money. They were both right. This chart shows cities our size here in the United States, and it measures their investment in police for those communities. On the left is Mayor James' understanding of the situation, and that's measuring police per capita. And he's right, we're near the top in terms of our spending on police per capita for our 500,000 population. But the police commissioner understood the city in the chart on the right, and that's measuring police protection per mile, which we have to think about that now because we're a city 4 times larger. So both those perspectives are right, but because of our development pattern, we do have the problem on the right that we need to address. If you go through and understand our city budget, you recognize that the only flexibility that our elected officials have is really in the general fund, which is about 1/3 of the city budget. A majority of the budget's dedicated. It's committed taxes. It's money that you can't do anything differently with. So that general fund is where we have the opportunity for change. Unfortunately, over the last 20 years, the general fund, if you track that top line, has been dropping as a percentage of the overall city budget. So it's becoming less and less of the city budget every year. At the same time, if you look at the public safety costs, our costs for public safety have been going up as a percentage of the general fund. So the general fund's coming down, the percent of it that's being needed for public safety is going up, which only means that we have less and less free money, less and less liquid money for us to use in other ways to invest in other parts of our city. It's part of the reason that although street preservation has gone up nominally over the last few years, it's still only a fraction of what we need. And it's a problem that's only getting worse. And now in particular with the COVID situation going around, we are really going to be facing some challenges going forward because we were already suffering before, and now we've seen a dramatic part of our revenue back to our city disappear. And that's going to be a challenge that's going to face us for many years now. So back to our value per acre map, I pointed out that our downtown area is typically the most productive. Urban 3 was surprised to see that we have 2 downtowns. Those spikes of purple there show the downtown area down near the river, and it also shows the Country Club Plaza district. Both of those are very productive development patterns. And what is highlighted in the yellow dash box there is the economic engine of our city, which is found from the river down to 75th Street between State Line and Troost. That is the most productive land in the overall part of the city. And it's what's allowing us to get by, even though it's not enough to make up for all of the underinvested parts of the city surrounding it. So you can look at that in a variety of ways. This is the view looking, seeing part of KCK. Not only did Urban 3 measure property taxes, they also measured sales taxes. And we tried really hard to measure the earnings tax, but that information is made not available. We're still trying to get a way around that, but it's not easy to access that. I'll tell you, my best way of understanding the earnings tax is to think of it as essentially being the same as property tax, because we can have that discussion separately, but it tracks out about the same. You can stack up all of these taxes and you'll still find that the economic engine is in that dash box there. And you can again see it in this map and relate that to the overall city. Now I need to give the civics lesson in the upper division course, because the part that I left out before was that part I alluded to when I said that the incentives that are baked into our public policies have helped a majority of us, but they've left out and then intentionally restricted our minority communities, particularly our African American communities, to participate in the wealth building that we've all enjoyed, that the majority has enjoyed for the last 200 years, particularly the last 75 years. And that's something that I've been very proud to see the chamber taking head on in terms of this issue of now it's time that we understand these issues. We need to be addressing the issue of shared prosperity and equity and development. So from that lens, when you look at this map, again, we are all real estate professionals. We know there's something strange about this map of Kansas City, because you can see that economic engine is too brightly contrasted from the areas just to the east of Troost. That doesn't make any sense at all from now my real estate 101 course, from everything we need to know about real estate, right? That area of Kansas City east of Troost is incredibly valuable from its location perspective. And the reason it's not glowing productive like this is because of public policy and programs that have been overlaid on those communities for the last 75 years. So you can see how that's tracked out through the redlining that started in the early part of the 1900s. And you can see a direct correlation between current values and those failed public policies. That's why we don't have shared prosperity. It's a fundamental reason why our city suffers in so many ways. And it's partly to do because we haven't been able to see development patterns. It's also to do because we haven't really recognized development policies. But we are starting to recognize that, and we're moving into a new era for Kansas City. So if we can start paying attention to value per acre, we have a great opportunity in Kansas City. Because we have very valuable land available to us for development that could provide incredible return on investment. Let me go back to this example of our existing two neighborhoods, the productive neighborhood on the left because of the development pattern, and the not productive development pattern on the right, which is what we built for the last 75 years. Now that we can understand return on investment in terms of infrastructure investment through this value per acre assessment, we see that right now they're both equally productive and that we need to increase the productivity of our city. It's going to be tough on the right to change that $250,000 home neighborhood to a $500,000 home neighborhood, to double the productivity of that part of our city. But it's not so hard on the left to imagine those $50,000 homes becoming $100,000 homes and doubling the value of that part of our city. In fact, it's not hard to imagine that over the next 20 years, those parts of our city couldn't become $150,000 homes, because the exact same development pattern is right across the street. And it's generating home values that are well beyond 150, and the only reason there's such a disparity is because of development policy and land use practices. We all recognize that now, and we have this great opportunity to change that. Now, the immediate thing we'll need to address, and that we already need to be addressing in our city, is the displacement that's going to create. Because we all know about gentrification. The reality is there are areas in our city already suffering from that, and the west side is the prime example, where we don't have policies in place that allow for the people that have maintained and created those communities to stay in place as development patterns start to take over. Well, we need to get those patterns in place, because if you look at that red line of Troost, you can see the bright yellow areas that are the productive lands. Well, they're starting to encroach to the east across that Troost line, because people are starting to recognize the real value there, and we're starting to get beyond the stigmas, and we're starting to change our market perceptions. So that line's already been broached in many areas, from Rockhurst down to finally Beacon Hill after many years. And even neighborhoods like Squire Park are really starting to heat up. And if you look at inflation patterns, even though those properties don't really show up in our market studies, you can see where there is already inflation pressure that's affecting ability for people living east of Truce to stay in place because of the growing cost of their property taxes and their property values. We don't have great public policies to address that yet. We have a few that we can kind of make work, but we need to make that much more workable so that our existing communities can stay in place as we go through this next era of development and build opportunities for wealth building for everybody in our city, including all those people living east of Truce. So that's one observation. The other is that we've got a great resource that we're squandering. Through an almost heroic effort, the mayor got us all to agree to put aside $800 million a year for infrastructure maintenance, which we desperately need. But unfortunately, it's being spent politically. As much of that money is going towards infrastructure, as much of that is also going towards failed development patterns. The poster child's in front of us, and there's too many examples like this that you can find in our current allocations of the general obligations bonds. Here we're spending $1.8 million on a greenfield development in an existing residential area, post-1950 area, that's going to create 18 homes. 1.8 million is going to create 18 homes that are worth maybe $200,000. If you do the math, you find pretty quickly that's about a 200-year return on investment. I don't know if any people on this call would take that investment. I'm pretty sure you wouldn't, but we're doing that with our general obligation bonds. It's the extreme case, but there are too many cases where the way we're using that money is not going to cause return on investment, and we need to be more strategic with that 800 million. The other thing that's going on is that we're having to address our consent decree and get our stormwater and sanitary effluent separated. And we're spending upwards to $5 billion on that, and we're having to, that's not a choice. So many of those areas are being reinvested in our east side. So you'll see programs like this that are starting to be investments in all throughout our central city, but particularly on the east side where the problems are most severe. But we're not aligning this major new and public investment with strategies for real estate development. And we should be. We should be taking advantage of this program. We should be taking better advantage of the GO bonds, and we should be taking great advantage of the return on the investment understanding to think about east of Truce neighborhoods dramatically differently, allowing that to be the opportunity to build shared prosperity and to rebuild the vitality of our overall city in a way that could really define Kansas City differently going forward. So I was very excited to get the opportunity to talk to this group in this way. We don't usually talk in this way when we have this presentation, but this is a great opportunity for Kansas City. And every time we give this presentation, people say, have you shared this with the elected officials? And we have, we've shared it with many elected officials, but that's not been the primary motivation because frankly, they're not in the position to make change. We, the business community, are in a position to make change. Our electeds are just going to follow the mandates given to them and public opinions and that kind of thing. We are the ones that understand how development affects the city's health. And we need to make this a stronger issue. We need to make this clear for our community and to our electeds. And that's why I'm really thrilled to have a chance to talk with you all about it, because this is the group that can provide the leadership our city needs going forward to make real change in our city in such a way that makes us a truly vital and exciting city to be in. So that's the presentation. I hope we have time. I hope I haven't talked too much. I hope we have time for some questions.
No, that's great, Dennis. And I do want to go ahead and open it up to questions. The first one's for me. How do you tailor this different to other audiences? Because the message is real kind of black and white and statistical. How, you say you were able to talk different to us. How do you have to talk different to the general public?
Oh, I spend more time explaining some of these things. One of the things that I make clear in the public presentation is that that we, in many ways, didn't see this coming. I didn't talk about that so much today, but we didn't sit down in 1950 and see this new development pattern unfolding in front of us and re-plan the way that we were going to budget ourselves so that we could afford it. And now we're in a position where we're recognizing it and we're struggling with it. So in that regard, there's not a lot of value in placing blame. Now on the equity side, there's plenty of value in having that discussion about the reasons why we've created inequities. That part of the discussion has been growing over the last 3 years as we've been making this presentation, because we've been learning, we've been understanding that and sharing it more and learning how to build that into this discussion, because it's an important part of the development pattern and the real estate policies that have affected the vitality of our city. I don't get into this, but I believe that the struggles of our school system, our Kansas City, Missouri's public school system, are a direct reflection of our failed real estate policies, because we destroyed those neighborhoods. And you can't have vital school districts in areas with destroyed neighborhoods and without healthy communities. So we can change that. We can change it the same way that we caused it, through development pattern and through reinvestment. I don't get into that either, but that's another 201 upper division discussion.
Questions? Questions for Dennis? Lob them in.
There's a question in the chat that I'll read, Dennis. It says, I learn more each time I see this presentation. Oh, no, it's not a question. I didn't read far enough. Anyway, just saying, ask it after another call. Thanks so much for the way you're thinking about these area opportunities and the opportunity for inclusive development. That was from Kathy Bennett.
Oh, great. Thanks, Kathy.
Are there any cities that have had this problem and dealt with it more successfully, or is this, like, is Kansas City particularly bad in this area? And this is
so that's another thing. Thank you. I appreciate that question. Yeah. That's another thing that we point out in the presentation is this isn't a unique problem for Kansas City. Almost every city in the country has this problem. San Francisco has this problem in a different way, but they have these problems. Kansas City just happens to be one of the poster childs because we expanded so much. And there are cities like Detroit was one, Oklahoma City, where there's a handful of us that really expanded a lot, and so we have it in a dramatic way. But every city has the same development problems. There are examples of cities that have fared well through addressing some of the things we're recommending. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the mid 1900s, changed their tax policy towards policy that valued location more than just improvements. And there are studies that have shown that because they did that, they didn't have the central city clearances that we saw through urban renewal programs, because property owners were being taxed based on the value of their location. They couldn't afford to tear down their buildings. They needed to generate some revenue just to afford their property. So those buildings stayed up. And now Pittsburgh is, if you've been there recently, it's one of the most vital cities we'll find going forward, because they have all this neighborhood stock that's in great shape that they're able to revitalize and carry forward. So that's an example of a city that had the foresight to change their tax policy. Actually, you have to go up into Canada to find cities that are doing really well in all regards, for who knows what reasons, but they've just got different attitudes about development and about city management that make them more productive and not have the challenges that we've got. But there aren't at all enough cities in the States that are addressing this issue head on. And I think one of the advantages we have in the city is that we're still a big, small town, and we have groups like this that can help focus on our future and create new policy and redirect policies in ways that can benefit us going forward.
Dennis, here's a question. How do you change people's mindsets from wanting a yard and space?
I don't know that we need to change people's mindsets about that. Those are great amenities. What we need to help people understand is that they're subsidized. The development pattern, the new valuation, the way of seeing the city makes it very clear that the productive parts of our city are subsidizing the non-productive parts. And we've always had that. Pre-1950, we had that, but it was in a much more compact way. Now we've spread out, and the majority of our city is subsidized by a minority of our city. And we don't think of it that way. Most people would tell you that their neighborhoods are subsidizing downtown redevelopment, which is so backwards in this understanding of the city, because we just don't understand it. So a big part of what we're trying to do is just help people now see their city more clearly, so we can make better choices going forward. So it's not trying to say you can't have this or you've got to do that. It's just to help us understand what the cost is of different development patterns, so you can make informed choices.
With three different counties doing valuations and a lot of tax policy being set at the state, is this a local issue or a state issue?
It's a local issue and a state issue. The state controls our ability to change property taxes. So if we want to change property taxes, we have to address it at that level. And we should, if we can, to try and create more productive tax policies. If we can't, we at a local level can change them through impact fees and transportation district fees and other strategies that are being used around the country to more reasonably tax property for the cost of service. But we should be tackling it however we can at the local level. That's where our best hope is.
This is Roxanne. Hi, Dennis.
Hi, Roxanne.
Question for you. So one question that I have, just have you done a comparison of Kansas City and how it's handled its budget and keeping up with infrastructure, say compared to other local suburban cities? Say compare it to the city of Liberty, compare it to Parkville, where largely, there's not a lot of multifamily housing comparatively, perhaps in those cities. I don't know, I could be wrong about that, but have you, and comparing their tax structure and how they budget and are able to keep up with their infrastructure, or maybe they're also not keeping up with their infrastructure, but have we done that comparison even within our own metro area?
So the Urban 3 study was done for both Kansas City, Missouri and Kansas City, Kansas. So there's a dramatic comparison because I mentioned this before, Kansas City, Kansas is closer to Detroit in terms of its disinvestment cycle. So they're in the desperation mode trying to figure out how to go forward. Same patterns apply over there. Unfortunately, they just don't have the same market, the same vitality to work with. So they have to be very surgical about where they make investments, and they're using this new information to be surgical, to be very strategic about where they're investing in new forms of housing to help revitalize neighborhoods. And they're actually ahead of us on the Kansas City, Missouri side in terms of using it to inform public policy. I'll tell you, the other part of it is we are working with a few communities. We hope to be working with more to help them understand these issues better. Some are already figuring it out on their own. City of Overland Park has been starting to recognize the reality of their development pattern. There's been plenty of articles recently that people have been complaining about their taxes. It's going to be interesting going forward because of this pandemic. It exposes a lot of ills, and one of the ills it's going to expose is a city that's living on the margins. And sales tax is particularly susceptible to situations like this, and cities that rely on sales tax are going to suffer. Overland Park is also suffering from the fact that they're just getting old enough for this to be a big deal. Kansas City, Missouri goes back to the 1850s, Overland Park maybe 1950, and their infrastructure is just aging to the point that it's starting to show the same stress. We're well into that stress cycle. But Overland Park is starting to have trouble paying their bills, and it's not surprising because these lessons on development pattern apply to every city. And it was okay when you were growing every year and you're adding new neighborhoods and new property tax streams. But if you weren't setting aside that money to take care of things, then it was going to catch up with you, and it is now catching up with cities. because they weren't setting aside those monies. They were investing them in parks and amenities and all sorts of other things that they now have to maintain. So it's an issue for almost every community throughout the country and here in the metro. We've intentionally focused this discussion on Kansas City, Missouri, because Kansas, Missouri has the whole range of issues to illustrate. And it was challenging enough to get the information just within Kansas City, Missouri, with all of our different jurisdictions. Jumping across the state line was a bigger challenge. So we focused it just on the KC-Mo area, but you could extrapolate the lessons learned to every community.
We have another question, this one from George Lopez. Should we be rethinking our streetcar planning to a more east-west orientation?
I think Frank was on the call earlier. I think he needs to answer that. I'm not the transit expert. If he's still on, I'm not sure if Frank's still on.
No, I'm still here. That I would direct that to Tom Guerin, since he directs the streetcar. From the KCATA side, a lot of our future planning is east-west from the bus perspective. You look at Linwood, look at Independence Avenue on those east-west corridors, connecting to the suburban areas. That's where our focus will be in the future. But as far as streetcar, we support the streetcar, but that their planning and director really comes from Tom and their board, not us.
So Frank's being very humble. They have a strategy that they're developing that is very wise in terms of building incrementally and encouraging the kinds of development that will allow us to be a healthy city. Part of the issue with our affordable housing is our transit cost. Since we're a car-based city, in many communities, they find that your transit costs are approaching your mortgage in terms of your monthly outlay. So it's as significant of a consideration as the mortgage or the rental costs for too many of our communities trying to afford to live here in Kansas City. A transit system that is designed to correspond to real estate development patterns so that we can provide housing that lines up with transit will allow us to more effectively address our affordable housing challenge, and also to build a city that can afford to have a good transit system and vice versa. And they're well down that path. So I'm excited to see what Frank's working on with ATA right now.
Thank you.
We have another question, which is, are you generally optimistic that we, being developers and real estate professionals, can solve these issues we face?
Yeah, I'll share this. We're not the only community having these discussions. There's a group called Strong Towns that started this discussion 15, 20 years ago now. And they've spurred interest in this discussion all around the country. There's a community down in the metro area of Dallas called Fate, Texas. Fate has taken on this one piece that we recommend in terms of being more, demanding more return on your infrastructure investment. Well, they've taken that square on, and they now require their development proposals to submit a pro forma, essentially, that shows the return on investment over a 20 or 40-year cycle. So the city can decide whether that's a reasonable development to accept. That's not happening very much around the country. I'm bringing that up because you would think that the development community would just push hard back against that because it's challenging the status quo. But what they're finding down there is the development community really wants to do good development. And when they're learning about these things, they're taking the challenge on head on, and they're changing their development patterns and trying to refigure how they can respond to the market within a reasonable context that makes good value long-term for the city. I think that's more often the case than not in our development community. I know that the Urban Land Institute is leading healthy city redevelopment discussions around our country. It's not coming from our city governance, it's coming from our private businesses as reflected through the UO. So I'm confident that this community will take that on as we understand it and recognize how we can build better value going forward.
No more chat questions right now.
Anybody got anything else for
Yeah,
Dennis?
this is Andrew. Sorry. I know some cities are doing more to incentivize infilling. I know that's a thing in Portland, and I'm from the West Coast originally, and a lot of cities in Oregon. Is that something like incentivizing building ADUs or splitting lots and things like that? Would that be something that could aid in this alleviating this problem as well?
Andrew, another great question. Thank you. Because what I haven't focused on enough here is that a lot of the development we need to be encouraging is the stuff that we never talk about in this group. It's the very small scale. It's duplexes, it's storefront buildings, it's small mixed use. It's the stuff that built the fabric of our city that is the foundation of our city's wealth. The big ticket shiny projects are great, but they don't drive the city. It's the foundation that drives the city. And unfortunately, through development policies, we've made it impossible for our central city neighborhoods to behave the way that they used to back before 1950. Our affordable housing solution is a long-term play. The reason we don't have affordable housing is we don't have diversity in housing. We don't have diversity in type, we don't have a diversity in age, and we don't have diversity in condition. So what that means is if you look at our older neighborhoods, they had a variety of ways that you could live there. You could live there in a single family home, you could live there in a duplex, you could live there in a colonnade building, and each of those had different price points. And depending on the condition of the building, your colonnade may be lesser than the one down the street because it hasn't been renovated in 15 years. But all those things made for diversity of accessibility that allowed for our city to be affordable. Well, development policy since 1950, all the new stuff we've built has taken all that out of the equation. And unfortunately, all those new policies have been laid back over our central city areas so that we can't even build that way anymore. If you tear down a fourplex in our central city, most of the city would not allow you to go back and rebuild that exact same fourplex because of our development policies. It's ridiculous. And not being able to do those kinds of development means we're not able to allow the community to respond to market and provide for its local market. So I think the first incentive is just to take away all the silly policies that are keeping us from building vital neighborhoods. That's the first thing. It's not a tax incentive. It's just to allow people to build what naturally would want to be building anyway in a vital neighborhood. But we do need some incentives. What we need to be careful about there is we need to be very thoughtful and strategic about how development goes forward now east of Troost. But we shouldn't be deferring taxes on people that can afford to build new there. Because many people can't afford to build new there. Many people can afford to buy a house and reinvest in it. And they don't need property tax abatement. The city needs that tax revenue. So we need a blended system that allows for new development to occur and for people that are already living there to be assisted so that they can get through the swing in property values that's going to happen over the next 10 to 20 years. And there are policies like that that are kind of in place, but aren't at all as strategic as they need to be to allow for both those things to happen. So it is a public policy issue. The first step is just to get back to allowing the kinds of development that make healthy neighborhoods and get the silly restrictions that we put in place over the last 75 years out of the way, and then to be adding to that some strategies so that we can allow for communities to stay in place while we go through the redevelopment process. I do want to thank everybody for this opportunity, and in general, thank the Chamber for all that you're doing. I really admire what the discussions you're leading in our community.
Yeah.
Well, Scott, we want to thank you and Danielle, the entire staff, for keeping these dialogues going and being the conduit for us. And absent any other comment, I think we're done.